Picture this: a palace drenched in moonlight, where laughter echoes through marble halls, but behind one locked door sits a girl too young to understand her crown. She was married before she could read, imprisoned before she could dream, and forgotten before she could live. Her name has faded from history's scrolls, but her story still haunts the corridors of the Mughal Empire. A tale of innocence traded for power, and silence mistaken for loyalty. The Mughal Empire, a realm of beauty, intellect, and unimaginable power. From its jeweled thrones to its perfumed gardens, it seemed a paradise built on perfection. But behind that golden veil lay stories rarely told. Stories of those trapped in the empire's shadow. Among them was a child whose name time tried to erase. In an age when marriages sealed alliances and royal women were pawns in the politics of blood, she became both a symbol of power and a prisoner of it. Born into nobility, she was promised to a prince before her 9th birthday. A child bride groomed for destiny she could not choose. Her wedding was a spectacle of gold and sorrow, witnessed by nobles who celebrated her as a gift to the empire. Yet just 3 years later, her laughter vanished from the palace gardens, and whispers began. Some said she had fallen ill, others that she had seen too much, and was locked away to preserve royal honor. Whatever the truth, her story became one of the Mughal court's most haunting secrets. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? We love seeing how far these forgotten stories travel. And if you enjoy exploring the darker, hidden corners of history, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share your thoughts. It helps us bring more lost voices like hers back to life. The story begins in the year 1628, when the empire was at its glittering height. The palaces of Agra shimmered beneath the Indian sun, their white marble glowing like captured moonlight. Inside those gilded walls, fate was written not by hearts, but by alliances. Every marriage, every union, was a transaction of power, and for one little girl, that power came wrapped in silk and sorrow. Her name, now lost to history, appears in old court letters as the youngest bride of the Mughal Zenana. She was 9 years old when her father, a nobleman desperate to secure his family's place in the court, offered her hand to a young prince, a boy barely 15, but already surrounded by whispers of ambition. The wedding was a spectacle of devotion and duty. Drums thundered through the palace courtyards, priests chanted verses, and gold coins rained upon the guests. To the empire, it was a union blessed by heaven. To her, it was a dream too bright to understand. She was dressed in brocade so heavy she could hardly move, her tiny hands painted with henna that told stories of love she could not yet read. As the veil covered her face, she watched her childhood fade away, the dolls she once played with replaced by jewels and expectations. That night, she was declared a queen in name, though her crown was nothing but a chain of duty. For the first few years, her life was quiet. The prince she was married to soon inherited a portion of the empire's responsibility. And she was kept in the women's quarters, the Zenana, where hundreds of royal wives, concubines, and servants lived behind screens. From sunrise to sunset, she was surrounded by luxury, fountains murmuring in courtyards, parrots calling from gilded cages, and the distant echoes of musicians rehearsing for royal feasts. Yet, in that splendor, she was invisible. The other women treated her kindly but distantly. They were mothers, widows, poets, dancers, each with their own survival carved into their eyes. She was a child among them, too young to understand the rules of silence that governed their world. But the walls of the Zenana were not just walls. They were prisons of marble and silk. No woman could leave without permission. Letters were read before being sent. The air itself seemed to hum with secrets. And so, the girl learned to hide her thoughts in the folds of her garments, and her dreams behind lowered eyes. She began to write on scraps of paper, small verses about freedom and rivers and skies, and hide them beneath the cushions of her bed. Centuries later, fragments of such poems would be discovered by historians in the palace archives, unsigned, written in the delicate Urdu of a child. One of them read simply, "The bird is golden, but the cage is wide." When she turned 12, everything changed. The prince, now a young man of 18, was sent on a military campaign to the Deccan, leaving her behind under the guardianship of his mother, a woman feared for her sharp mind and stricter will. Without the prince's protection, the child bride became a pawn once more, a symbol of political alliance that no longer served its purpose. Rumors spread in the court that her father had fallen out of favor, accused of plotting against the Yuo, emperor's advisors. And in the Mughal palace, where loyalty was valued more than blood, that was enough to turn affection into suspicion. One evening, the queen mother ordered that the girl be confined to her chambers for her safety. But everyone knew what that meant: exile within the very palace that once celebrated her. From that night on, the garden she used to walk in became off-limits. Her laughter, once echoing through the courtyards, vanished. Servants spoke to her, only when necessary, and her meals were delivered through a side passage. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The world outside continued. Festivals, conquests, poetry. But inside her chamber, time froze. The girl watched the sky change through the lattice window, measuring the years by the color of the monsoon clouds. She was no longer a child, yet not allowed to grow into a woman. Her hair lengthened, her hands grew steady, but her world stayed the same size. A few steps of marble, a flicker of candlelight, and the sound of distant prayers at dusk. But what makes her story more haunting is that she did not despair, at least, not at first. Those who later served her said she spoke softly to herself, reciting verses from memory, inventing new ones when loneliness pressed too heavily. Sometimes she would place a single flower by her window, watching its petals wilt day by day, whispering, "We fade together." A record kept by one palace chronicler, a rare act of empathy in those times, notes that she kept her grace, though sorrow was her only companion. That line alone, preserved in the chronicles of an empire that forgot her name, is all that remains of her humanity. Imagine it. A 12-year-old girl, locked behind walls taller than trees, watching the empire grow beyond her reach. Her father executed, her husband gone, her voice erased from the court. And yet, somewhere within that silence, she kept something alive, a fragile defiance, invisible but unbroken. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps only memory. The palace guards who walked past her chambers claimed they could sometimes hear her humming softly in the night, her voice carrying through the corridors like a prayer, a child's lullaby echoing. In a kingdom too busy to care, no one knows exactly how long she remained imprisoned. Some accounts say 5 years, others claim longer. By the time her husband returned from the south, Victory behind him and ambition before him, she was a ghost within his own palace. He visited once, historians say, and turned away without a word. For him, she was a reminder of politics gone wrong, a relic of his youth, bound to a family that no longer existed. After that, the door to her chamber was closed for good, and so her story slipped from record into rumor. Servants whispered that she had gone mad, that she spoke to her reflection as if it were a friend. Others believed she had turned to mysticism, fasting for days, her chamber filled with the scent of incense and the sound of prayer. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. She disappeared from the chronicles after that. The next mention of her name appears decades later, in a traveler's journal describing a silent lady who lived in the palace's forgotten wing, writing poems on the walls in charcoal. The traveler described the words as filled with both longing and peace, as if the poet had made peace with her cage. The years moved like shadows across the marble floors of the palace, and with each passing season, the little girl grew into a woman no one remembered. The empire that had once celebrated her marriage had changed. New faces ruled the courts, new poets sang of glory, and wars kept the emperor far from Agra. Yet within the palace, her presence became a rumor that refused to die. Servants whispered of the silent chamber in the eastern wing, a room where the curtains were never drawn, where a single candle burned through every night. Some claimed they saw her through the lattice once, standing motionless, her face calm, her eyes distant. They began to call her the Veiled Saint, believing she prayed for the empire's peace. Others feared her, saying that her silence was a curse upon those who had wronged her family. It was around this time that an unlikely visitor entered her life, a young palace scribe named Rahim, newly appointed to organize the archives of royal correspondence. He was curious, sharp, and quietly rebellious, the kind of man who noticed what others ignored. One evening, while sorting through old petitions, he discovered a bundle of letters sealed with her father's crest. Letters never delivered, pleading for his daughter's release. The words were filled with desperation, loyalty, and confusion. "She is only a child, Your Majesty. Let not her. Innocence bear the punishment of my politics." Rahim read them in silence, then slipped them into his robe. The next night, he left a small note near her door, unsigned, unsealed, containing only 2 words: "You are remembered." No one knows if she ever read that message, but something shifted after that night. The guards later told how, for the first time in years, she asked for paper and ink. And soon after, fragments of her writing began to appear again. Verses left on walls, on discarded scrolls, on the underside of her food trays. They were short, cryptic, yet unbearably beautiful. One read, "A star falls into the sea, but the sea remembers." Another, "When silence becomes a habit, freedom becomes a dream." The palace servants, unsure what to do, collected the one between scraps and delivered them to Rahim, who began secretly copying them into a journal. Those poems, later smuggled out and preserved by generations of scribes, became what scholars now call the Tears of the Crescent Bride, a rare glimpse into the inner world of a woman erased by her own empire. As her words spread quietly among the palace workers, her legend began to grow. Some said she had visions during her long solitude, that she spoke of dreams where rivers turned into mirrors, and stars whispered secrets of lost queens. Others claimed she had become a mystic, fasting through moon cycles, her chamber filled with a faint scent of jasmine and sandalwood. A few even believed she could heal, that a servant once fell ill, and upon hearing her prayers through the wall, recovered by morning. Whether true or not, her myth began to outgrow her reality. What had begun as a punishment transformed into prophecy. Meanwhile, the political storms outside grew darker. The Mughal Empire was entering a period of unrest, revolts, shifting, loyalties, and the slow erosion of absolute power. The prince who had once been her husband was now a hardened ruler, scarred by years of battle and betrayal. He rarely spoke of his past, but one chronicler noted that he often paused before the Ayun eastern wing during his midnight walks, staring at the darkened windows. Perhaps guilt haunted him. Perhaps memory. He had imprisoned her once to secure his throne, but now, in his later years, that decision followed him like a shadow he could not shake. One monsoon night, when thunder rolled across the Yamuna and lightning flickered over the palace domes, a servant brought him troubling news. The woman in the eastern wing had fallen gravely ill. The prince dismissed it at first, but when dawn came and the news returned, "She does not speak, my lord." Something stirred in him. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, he walked toward her chamber. The doors creaked open, and what he found was not the girl he remembered, but a ghost of her. Fragile, thin, her eyes still bright but distant, like stars seen through mist. She did not bow, nor cry, nor speak. She simply looked at him, her lips forming words he could not hear. Perhaps she forgave him. Perhaps she cursed him. No record tells us. The prince stood there for a long time, and then turned away, leaving. The door opened behind him. That was the last time they ever saw each other. After that, the chronicles grow faint again. Her illness lingered, and the palace avoided mentioning her name. Months passed, and then a quiet death notice appeared. In the Imperial Register. One line, written in delicate Persian. "The consort of the House of the Moon has returned to the mercy of God." No procession, no ceremony, no remembrance. She was buried not in the grand gardens of queens, but in a small courtyard near the servant quarters, an unmarked grave beneath a neem tree. The empire moved on, as empires always do, its walls swallowing the echo of her existence. But her story did not end there. A few decades later, travelers visiting Agra began to record strange tales told by local guides. They spoke of a voice heard at night near the old palace, a woman's song, soft and sorrowful, carried by the wind. The locals said it was the spirit of the child queen, still singing the verses she was never allowed to share. Others believed it was only the wind through the marble screens. Yet somehow, her poems continued to surface, etched faintly on the palace walls, hidden in old manuscripts, even quoted by later Mughal princesses who admired her defiance. Over time, she became a symbol, not of tragedy alone, but of endurance. One 18th-century poet, inspired by her legend, wrote, "She was caged, yet her words flew beyond empires." That line captured what her life had come to mean, a quiet rebellion against silence itself. In a world where women were seen, but not heard, her whispers traveled through centuries. And even now, historians debate who she truly was, some identifying her as a forgotten niece of Shah Jahan, others as a minor noble's daughter married into the royal household. But beyond the details lies something larger, the truth that her voice, though nearly erased, refused to die. If you ever visit Agra, and stand near the old palace ruins, you might still see the faint outline of her window, carved with lattice work like frozen lace. Locals say if you place your ear to the stone at dusk, you can hear the faint hum of a melody, not words, just the soft rhythm of a girl once dreaming of freedom. Whether it's imagination or echo, no one knows, but the air itself seems to. Remember her, and maybe that's the real mystery, that a life so small, so forgotten, could leave behind a silence that still speaks, that even without a name, her presence lingers, in verses, in whispers, in the slow rustle of the palace wind. Because history has a strange way of keeping its ghosts alive, especially those who were never allowed to speak while they lived. Centuries passed, and the world beyond the palace changed. Empires fell, new nations rose, and the marble corridors of Agra became ruins visited by curious travelers and weary historians. Dust gathered where once music had echoed, and the courtyards that once shimmered with royal processions stood quiet beneath the weight of time. But among the relics and broken fountains, there remained one enduring trace: the faint inscriptions on the wall of an abandoned chamber, carved by a delicate hand. The words were almost invisible, faded by centuries of monsoon winds and sun, yet they pulsed with emotion. To live unseen is still to live. To be forgotten is still to feel. It was then that the scholars who uncovered them realized whose room they had found: the chamber of the forgotten bride, the child who had been married to a prince, locked away by politics and immortalized by her silence. The rediscovery sparked quiet fascination among historians and poets alike. British officers during the colonial period wrote brief mentions of her in their reports, describing her as a tragic princess of the early Mughal Zenana. Indian scholars, however, looked deeper. They connected her inscriptions with a series of surviving manuscripts, fragile Urdu and Persian poems that had been recopied over generations by nameless scribes. When pieced together, they revealed a voice unlike any other from that time: gentle yet fierce, tender yet philosophical. Her writings were not of bitterness, but of understanding, as if she had reached beyond her suffering into something eternal. One verse, translated later, read, "The moonlight that imprisons me is the same that touches the sea. Freedom does not need a door." Imagine discovering those words after 300 years. The thoughts of a woman silenced at 12, now echoing across centuries. Her story became a mirror reflecting not just her era, but the deeper truth about how societies remember women, not as rulers or rebels, but as whispers between the lines of history. As more of her verses were uncovered, a new image of her emerged, not merely as a victim, but as a philosopher trapped in confinement, who found liberation in thought when her body was denied freedom. The Mughal palace that once silenced her had unknowingly preserved her rebellion in its walls. Modern researchers now believe that her writings may have subtly influenced later Mughal women, especially princesses who began supporting education for girls within the royal household. The faint shift in court poetry, from devotion to introspection, from beauty to freedom, appeared shortly after her time. Could her hidden poems have circulated quietly among the women of the Zenana, inspiring them to think differently about their own confinement? It's possible. In one later letter by a Mughal princess named Zeb-un-Nisa, she writes, "I learned of a caged bird who sang of light, and in her song I found my own." That single line, preserved in Persian anthologies, is often seen as a tribute to the child bride who never escaped her marble cage, but whose words flew across generations. And yet, for all her influence, her identity remains uncertain. Historians, Portivi, still argue, was she the daughter of a noble who fell from grace? A distant relative of the emperor's household? Or merely one among hundreds of women trapped in political marriages that shaped dynasties? Perhaps that's why her story lingers, because it represents not just one forgotten girl, but an entire generation of women whose names were replaced by titles, whose lives were measured only by their usefulness to men. She is both specific and symbolic, a ghost of one and the voice of many. But here's the chilling part. The palace where she once lived still stands, though tourists rarely visit that wing. The air inside feels colder, as if holding its breath. The ceiling has cracked, and the fountains are dry. Yet the window, the same lattice that once framed her view of the sky, still filters sunlight into 1,000 trembling shapes. On certain afternoons, when the light falls just right, it illuminates the faint carvings she made. Verses now almost gone, yet still readable to those who know where to look. Local guides sometimes tell her story to visitors, though they speak it softly, as if afraid to disturb her spirit. They call her the forgotten Queen of Whispers. Standing there, one can almost feel the overlap of past and present. The same sunlight she once saw, the same hum of the Yamuna far below. You realize that history isn't buried. It lingers, breathing through the silence. Her story becomes not just an ancient tragedy, but a reflection of how little the world has changed. Even today, across cultures and centuries, there are still children whose fates are decided by others, whose dreams are traded for honor, whose voices are silenced long before they can speak. Her story becomes their story. Her poems, once hidden beneath marble, become a message carried through time. Even silence remembers. In 2012, a restoration team working on the palace rediscovered more of her writings, this time hidden behind a panel of decorative plaster. They found a small inscription written in the early 1600s Mughal hand, still faint but legible under the dust. It read, "I was born twice, once into the world, once into silence." That line, now engraved on a small plaque outside her chamber, stands as her epitaph. Schoolchildren who visit often stop to read it, their teachers explaining how it speaks of resilience, the ability to find meaning even when denied a voice. Scholars call it one of the earliest examples of proto-feminist thought in South Asian history. But beyond the labels, what she left behind was something simpler: proof that the human spirit, even when caged, can create beauty that outlives empires. If you listen to her story closely, it's not just about sorrow. It's about endurance. The kind of quiet courage that doesn't make noise, but refuses to disappear. She may have been forgotten by those who ruled, but she's remembered by those who study, those who imagine, and those who feel the weight of silence. Her life reminds us that history is not only written by the victors. Sometimes it's whispered by those who were never allowed to speak. And so, her legacy continues. Not in monuments, but in words, in empathy, in the haunting reminder that behind every golden age lies someone unseen. When the tourists leave and the palace falls quiet, the wind still passes through her window, carrying a faint sound. Not quite music, not quite memory, but something in between. Perhaps it's the echo of her laughter before the marriage, before the imprisonment, before her world was sealed. Perhaps it's the sound of her freedom, finally unbound by time. Whatever it is, it endures. Soft, eternal, unbroken. Because some stories are not meant to vanish. They're meant to remind us of innocence lost, of voices silenced, of the cost of power and the strength of the human soul. And as long as her words remain carved into that stone, even faintly, she is still speaking. Across centuries, across empires, across silence itself, her story is more than a fragment of history. It's a mirror held up to humanity. The child bride of the Mughal palace never ruled a kingdom, never led an army, never appeared in grand portraits. And yet, she left something far greater behind, a quiet defiance that refused to die. Her voice, carved in whispers, still cuts through centuries of silence. She reminds us that even in the darkest corners of history, courage can exist in the smallest acts, in a word written on a wall, in a song hummed to oneself, in the decision to keep breathing when the world has forgotten your name. As we close her chapter, take a moment to listen, not to the noise of power, but to the faint heartbeat of resilience that still echoes through time. Because remembering her is not about sorrow, it's about witness to a life that mattered, even when no one was watching. If you were moved by this story, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what kind of forgotten stories you'd like to see next, because every voice, no matter how lost, deserves to be heard again.